The Vietnam War began with noble ideals, initiated by men who believed they were acting in good faith. However, 2 decades later, the reality had shifted drastically. For the Vietnamese, this was never a war about communism. It was a war for survival, a war for independence. It was a war for Vietnam. But a fatal combination of American hubris, Cold War paranoia, and the very imperialist tendencies the U.S. had once opposed turned the conflict into one of the darkest chapters in American history. By the time the guns fell silent, more than 58,000 Americans had lost their lives. Alongside them, 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers perished. On the other side, over 1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong guerrillas were killed. Most tragically, over 2 million civilians from the North and South, as well as thousands from Laos and Cambodia, became casualties of the crossfire. The story goes back to the French conquest of Indochina in 1858. The French boasted of bringing civilization, building roads and bridges, but the Vietnamese rejected their new masters, just as they had resisted Chinese invasions for centuries. To them, the French were simply the enemy. In 1919, following the Great War, President Woodrow Wilson traveled to Paris to advocate for a new world order. During his stay, a Vietnamese man tried to present a petition asking for his country's independence. Though promised an audience, there is no evidence Wilson ever saw it. This man, who used over 70 aliases, eventually chose the name Ho Chi Minh, the bringer of light. After years in exile and discovering the anti-colonial writings of Lenin, he embraced communism, fueled by a singular desire, an independent Vietnam. By 1940, World War II had erupted. Germany occupied France, and Japan moved into Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh returned home to organize a revolutionary movement, the Viet Minh. They utilized guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run strategies that would define the war 30 years later. In 1945, the American OSS, the precursor to the CIA, actually supplied Ho Chi Minh with weapons to fight the Japanese. They were impressed by his men. Ho even praised the U.S. as a champion of democracy. When the atomic bombs fell and Japan surrendered, Ho Chi Minh seized the moment. On September 2, 1945, he proclaimed Vietnam independent. The future seemed bright, but Franklin Roosevelt was dead, and Harry Truman faced a new threat, the Soviet Union. The Cold War had begun. France warned that without their colonies, they would fall to Soviet influence. Fearing the Domino Theory, the idea that if one nation fell to communism, others would follow, the U.S. backed France's return to Vietnam. By 1953, despite American aid, the French were crumbling. In a desperate gamble, they set up a base at Dien Bien Phu, daring the Viet Minh to attack. They underestimated the enemy. 50,000 Vietnamese surrounded the valley, trapping the French. After 55 days of siege, the French surrendered. Colonial rule was over. The Geneva Accords split Vietnam at the 17th parallel. Civilians were given 300 days to choose a side. 900,000 fled south to escape communism. The South became the Republic of Vietnam under President Diem, while Ho Chi Minh ruled the North from Hanoi. But peace did not last. Guerrilla fighters known as the Viet Cong began infiltrating the South along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, determined to unite the country. Enter John F. Kennedy. With Cold War tensions at an all-time high, Kennedy could not appear weak. Advisors urged him to send ground troops, but he refused, opting instead for elite Green Berets and military advisors. He increased aid and authorized the use of chemical defoliants like Orange Agent to strip the jungle of cover. However, the government in the South was rotting from within. President Diem's oppression of Buddhists led to shocking protests. The world watched in horror as a monk set himself on fire in a silent, burning martyrdom. Realizing Diem was a liability, the U.S. did not stop a military coup. Diem was assassinated. 3 weeks later, Kennedy himself was killed in Dallas. Lyndon Johnson inherited chaos. The South was unstable, with governments rising and falling within months. Then came the Gulf of Tonkin. Reports claimed North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked the USS Maddox. While the first attack was minor, a reported second attack, which likely never happened, gave Johnson the justification he needed. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting the president carte blanche authority to wage war. Retaliatory airstrikes began, but the Viet Cong responded by targeting American bases. In March 1965, Johnson launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign, and finally sent ground troops. The mission had changed. It was no longer about helping the South. It was about avoiding American humiliation. By 1966, 200,000 American men were in Vietnam. They faced an enemy that moved through 12,000 miles of jungle tunnels and trails. The U.S. dropped more bombs on the Ho Chi Minh Trail alone than were used on Germany and Japan combined during World War II. Yet the enemy persisted. General Westmoreland demanded more troops, relying on a strategy of attrition. The body count became the only metric of success. But back home, Americans didn't care about the kill ratio. They cared about their sons. The environment itself was a killer. Soldiers trudged through elephant grass, faced 20-meter-tall bamboo, and suffered from rotting infections caused by leeches. Booby traps and landmines maimed thousands. Furthermore, the M16 rifles often jammed in the heat of battle, costing lives. Even when Americans won a battle, they would leave the hill, only for the enemy to return the next day. By 1967, protests in America were intensifying. The government promised there was light at the end of the tunnel. They were wrong. January 1968, the Tet Offensive. During the Lunar New Year truce, 84,000 communist troops launched a coordinated assault on over 100 cities and towns in the South. The fighting was brutal. For the first time, the war moved from the jungles to the city streets.
Although the US and South Vietnamese forces eventually repelled the attack and decimated the Viet Cong, it was a psychological defeat. The American public watching the carnage on their televisions realized they had been lied to. The enemy was not defeated. Walter Cronkite questioned the war, and Johnson's approval ratings plummeted. On March 31, 1968, Johnson stunned the world. He would halt the bombing and would not seek re-election. The nation unraveled. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, then Robert Kennedy. Riots consumed American cities. In this turmoil, Richard Nixon was elected on a promise to end the war. But behind the scenes, a dark political game was played. Behind the scenes, Johnson had been close to a peace deal, but Nixon's campaign secretly urged the South Vietnamese to boycott the talks, promising a better deal under a Nixon presidency. Johnson knew of this treason, but kept it quiet. The war dragged on. American soldiers continued to die for hills they would later abandon, like Hamburger Hill. Nixon introduced Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing U.S. troops while training the South Vietnamese to fight alone. But morale collapsed. Then came the revelation of My Lai. The public learned that American soldiers had massacred over 500 unarmed civilians. The anti-war movement exploded. At Kent State University, National Guardsmen shot and killed 4 student protesters. Finally, in January 1973, after a massive Christmas bombing campaign against Hanoi, a peace deal was signed. Prisoners of war were released, and the last American combat troops left. The U.S. promised to return if the South was threatened, but when the North invaded in 1975, a scandals-filled